You'll remember that we were reading the book, The Boy Who Fell Off the Mayflower, or John Hallen's Good Fortune by P.J. Lynch. And today we will start here. Truth is, we were getting desperate, not only for food, but a place to settle. Each day that passed, more of our people on board the Mayflower felt sick. Bob Coppin recalled a likely place for his time mapping with Captain Smith, and a party of us set up in the shallop, remember that's the small boat, to find it. But we made slow progress. The cold wind lashed the hail in our faces, and the water froze on our clothes and made them like coats of iron. When it got dark, we put ashore to rest the night. We built a rough stockade for shelter. We got little sleep, though, for the hideous cries we heard in the dark. In the morning, one of our company ran screaming, "Indians! Indians!" And straightway a hail of arrows came zipping all around. We rushed to our muskets and fired back. Bob and some of our men got separated down at the boat. They had muskets, but no firebrand to fire them with. I ran to the fire, grabbed the burning log, and scrambled down the beach to our fellows, who took fire and started shooting at our attackers. We could see the Indian's leader fearlessly letting fly his arrows from behind a tree, only half a musket shot away from us. "That must be the man whose corn you took," shouted Bob. Captain Standish finally hit the very tree itself, and the Indian took flight with a great cry, with the rest of his band behind him. So it pleased God to give us deliverance from our attackers without killing a one of them, or getting a scratch on one of our own. Safe Harbor is the subheading here. We collected ourselves and loaded into the shallop right quick and cast off, heading north along the coast. We sailed with the icy winds whipping all around us that day without seeing a harbor, a river, or even a creek. A squall blew up of a sudden, and with Bob Coppin and me leaning on the tiller to steer us away from the rocks, the hinges of our rudder broke. There was nothing we could do but try to steer with our oars. Over the din of the storm, Bob shouted, "Be of good cheer, lad. I see it. I see the harbor." And we cut in for the break at the shoreline. The wind behind us now was so strong that our mast shattered, and with our rudder hanging loose, the shallop was tossed like a toy from one huge breaker to the next. It was only by God's mercy that our boat was borne into the shelter of a small island rather than being broken into pieces along the rocky shore. Turned out it wasn't the place that Bob had thought. But when we had a chance to sound the harbor and survey the land around, we agreed that this was indeed a most hopeful place for our settlement. It seemed to us that the Lord had saved us from the deluge and carried us here, for we found the land had already been cleared for cornfields. There were graves and bones aplenty, yet there were no living Indians to be seen. We repaired the shallop as best we could and sailed back to the Mayflower to tell of our discovery. But there was grim news at the ship. In the 6 days that we had been exploring, more of our people had taken sick, and more still had perished. Old Master Chilton and William Bradford's wife, Dorothy, were among them. Christmas Day, 1620. Master Jones sailed the Mayflower up to our new situation. He announced to us that the place was called New Plymouth on Captain Smith's map. Now we knew that God's hand had guided us across the ocean from Plymouth, our last port in England, to Plymouth, our new home in New England. I was part of a landing party of 20 put ashore to build houses, but we were tormented by foul weather and made little progress. I never thought things could get more miserable than on the ship, but as we looked through the rain and sleet to where the Mayflower was, anchored in the bay, we envied the comfort of our friends still on board. Sometimes we saw Indians watching us from the dark of the forest. At night, we'd hear terrible cries that would make us shudder to our very bones. One morning when Captain Standish woke us, he was less gruff than usual. "It's Christmas Day, lads. God save you all. Looks to be a dry one. We'll get those gables built if it stays good." He warmed us up to heft an axe and pull a saw, and before long we had hoisted up the frame of the first house. At noon, we stopped for thin soup and the ship's biscuits. Standish gave us each an extra piece of salted cod, too. "Don't tell Elder Brewster." As we chewed, I remembered the last Christmas I had spent with my mother and my brothers, games and songs with Arthur and little Henry, mutton pies and roasted goose, a hug and a smile, and Merry Christmas, John, from my mother. Roger pulled me to my feet. Come on, dreamer, back to work. In 2 weeks, the house was built. Before the thatching was pinned down, Roger and I had bagged a spot for our mattresses in the loft. It was smokier up there, and it made Roger's cough worse, but at least it was dry. Downstairs, the rain sloshed in, and the floor was wet mud. Before long, though, we had to make room for the sick. Captain Jones wanted them off the ship, so Roger and I were back under canvas. At first, the women tended to the afflicted, while the men worked on the houses, but soon most of the women were ill, too. At times, only 6 or 7 of us remained well enough to tend to the others. Lizzie and the women were up before dawn boiling dried peas for pottage, but those that were poorly ate little or nothing. Most of our time was spent cleaning the sick and washing their filthy bedding. I helped with Lizzie's father and her uncle, and then with Roger. The work was so loathsome that I thought it a blessing to be ordered out into the cold and rain to fell trees and split planks. A few of the sick, like William Bradford, recovered, but in spite of all the care that young Lizzie Tilly gave to her family, they all died, one after another, mother, father, aunt, and uncle. We buried our dead at night so the Indians might not see our true weakness. Our great adventure was becoming a nightmare of sickness, death, and danger. By the time winter was over, Roger had died, and so had most of the other servants, lads too. Of 100 and odd persons, scarce 50 of us were left. Welcome, Englishmen. With the arrival of spring, the bitterness had gone from the north wind. We had fewer sick folk and more houses built. One morning, a tall, fine-looking Indian walked boldly into our village. He walked right up to Captain Standish and said, "Welcome, Englishmen." His name was Samoset. He had learned some English from the men on the fishing boats who visited this coast, and he was right friendly and peaceable. We gave him food and some little gifts. Later, he came back with other Indians. One was Squanto, who spoke English nearly as well as me. He told us about his own people, who had lived in the place where we'd settled. He told us about the mighty Sachem who ruled the land, and the great King Massasoit of the Wampanoag, and of his mighty warriors. Massasoit. It was arranged that Massasoit himself should come to our settlement, and we welcomed him as royally as if he were the cousin of the King of England. Mistress Carver and the other women prepared our finest foods, and it was my job to serve it to the governor and the Indian Sachem. It was months since I had seen such a spread. Massasoit must have seen how hungrily I looked at it, for he smiled and offered me a leg of the roast duck. I confess I took it and ate as much as I could before my mistress scolded me and took it from me with a hard slap, to the great amusement of Massasoit. After much discussion, Governor Carver and Massasoit made a solemn peace treaty between our two peoples. Then they embraced and exchanged gifts as if they were old friends. When Massasoit and his men left, Squanto stayed with us. He said Patuxet was his home.